The sun hummed high in a clear, blue sky, casting a gentle warmth over the quiet town square. Brick buildings with old, hand-painted signs line the streets, their colors faded but full of character, like relics of a time gone by. A few townsfolk wandered through, stopping at the hardware store or idling outside the local cafe, cups of coffee in hand. It was a small, unassuming place, the kind of town where news traveled faster than the trains that rumbled through only twice a day. Into this small world, Dr. Caleb Monroe and his teenage son, Darnell, arrived. Their truck, worn but reliable, had North Carolina plates that still held the dust of miles driven. Caleb, a man of quiet strength in his mid-40s, was dressed neatly in a light blue shirt and dark slacks. He moved with the purpose of someone who had faced challenges and chosen to keep going. By his side, Darnell wore a baseball cap and a guarded expression, glancing around with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, the town's casual hum seemed to fade, replaced by the heavy silence of curious stares. People paused mid-sentence, letting their words hang in the air as they watched the new arrivals with open, assessing eyes. A group of older men sat outside the cafe, clutching their coffee cups, eyes narrowing as they took in the sight of a black doctor in their midst. One man muttered something under his breath, and the others nodded in agreement, each of them casting Caleb and Darnell the sort of look that could only come from a place steeped in years of tradition, some spoken and some unspoken. Caleb noticed the stares, of course, but he had learned long ago to meet such looks with a calm, even expression. He kept his posture tall, his gaze steady as he took in the town square with a faint, thoughtful smile. "It's not just a place, Darnell," Caleb said, his voice calm yet carrying a weight that only his son would catch. "It's our new home." Darnell shifted uncomfortably. The teenager was used to being the new kid in town, but this place felt different somehow. The glances seemed sharper, the silence deeper. He looked at his dad, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Feels like they're all staring, Dad," he muttered, hands shoved deep into his pockets. Caleb gave a slight nod, a gentle expression crossing his face. "Let him look," he said, patting his son's shoulder. "We're here to help. They'll see that in time." But even as he said it, Caleb knew it wouldn't be that simple. This town, with its history and its way of doing things, wouldn't accept change easily. He'd known that the moment he accepted the job, but that hadn't stopped him then, and it wouldn't stop him now. They continued past the cafe, each step a little more confident than the last, and soon reached the building that would serve as Caleb's clinic. It was a modest, red brick structure, unremarkable at first glance, but to Caleb, it was a beacon of possibility. A small, hand-carved wooden sign read, "Monroe Medical Clinic," its letters simple and unassuming, much like the town itself. Caleb took a deep breath, his faint smile returning as he looked at the building. This was where he would build his practice, and if he could, maybe something more, a bridge to a community that had probably never dreamed of seeing a doctor who looked like him. Darnell, still hovering by the truck, noticed the way his father looked at the building inside. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, half hoping his father might waver, might show even a hint of doubt. Caleb turned to him, his eyes clear and determined. "I've never been more sure, son," he replied softly. He could feel the weight of this decision, but it was a weight he was willing to carry. They walked up to the building together, pushing open the door and stepping inside. The interior was sparse, with a single wooden desk, a few empty chairs, and some faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. It was nothing fancy, but to Caleb, it was perfect. This was where he would begin, where he would make his mark, not with fanfare, but with steady, honest work. Inside the clinic, the air was cool and slightly stale, the scent of old wood mingling with the faint, clinical smell of antiseptic. A woman stood by the front desk, her posture tense, shoulders pulled tight as she glanced nervously around the room. Sarah Thompson was her name, a nurse in her early 30s with kind eyes and a warmth that Caleb sensed despite her tension. She turned as Caleb and Darnell entered, her eyes widening slightly as she took them in. Caleb could see a flicker of something in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe a hint of discomfort. But she recovered quickly, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. "You must be Dr. Monroe," she said, her voice polite, but with a hint of reservation. She glanced at Darnell, offering him a quick nod before looking back at Caleb. "I'm Sarah Thompson, the nurse here. They, assigned me to work with you." Caleb smiled warmly, sensing her hesitation. He shook her hand firmly, nodding. "Thank you, Sarah. I'm glad to have you on the team," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. He had a way of putting people at ease, and he hoped it would work with Sarah, too. Sarah gave a quick nod, looking around as if to avoid his gaze. "Well, I hope you'll find things to your liking here. The people, well, they don't take to change easily," she said, her words careful, as if she were stepping around something fragile. Caleb nodded, understanding. He'd known that coming in. "That's all right, Sarah," he replied. "I've dealt with a lot of things in my time. We're here to do good work. They'll see that, eventually." Sarah glanced up at him, her expression softening slightly. She looked at Darnell, who had been listening quietly, his gaze flicking between the adults. "Well, I hope you're right," she said softly. She hesitated, as if weighing her next words, then added, "Some folks, they might not make it easy for you." Caleb gave her a gentle smile, his voice calm. "I don't expect it to be easy. I just expect it to be worth it." Darnell shifted beside him, still taking everything in. He hadn't said much, but Caleb knew his son was watching closely, trying to make sense of this new life, this new challenge. As they settled in, a faint but undeniable sense of hope stirred in Caleb's chest. This place, with its faded walls and uncertain stairs, might just be the start of something remarkable. And as he looked around the small clinic, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was exactly where he needed to be. Next day, the sound of footsteps echoed in the clinic's waiting room as a woman in her mid-50s walked in, her heels clicking confidently against the worn linoleum floor. Mayor Rose Johnson was a woman of stature, both in her presence and her influence in the town. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit with silver buttons, she carried herself with a formality that Caleb immediately recognized. She wasn't a woman who left things to chance. Caleb extended a hand, his expression respectful but reserved. "Mayor Johnson, I assume?" She gave a firm handshake, her face a practiced mask of warmth mixed with caution. "Dr. Monroe, I wanted to be the first to welcome you personally. We're glad to have someone with your qualifications in town," she said, her voice formal yet polite. The someone lingered in the air, its implications clear. Caleb nodded, meeting her gaze with the calm he had perfected over years of facing similar resections. "Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate the opportunity to serve this community," he replied, his voice measured. Rose glanced around the clinic, her gaze sweeping over the empty waiting chairs and the sparse decor. She seemed to be assessing every detail, weighing her words before speaking again. "I imagine it will take some time for folks to get used to change," she said carefully, her eyes returning to Caleb's. "But I'm sure, with patience, they'll come to appreciate your presence here." Caleb allowed a slight smile, his voice steady. "That's my hope, Mayor. I've always believed that good work speaks louder than words." Rose's expression softened, just a little. She looked at him with something close to admiration, though she quickly masked it. "Well, that's good to hear. This town could use someone who believes in that." She paused, choosing her words with precision. "Just know that if you ever need anything, my office is always open. I want you to know that we support your work here, and we'll do our best to make this transition as smooth as possible." Caleb nodded, appreciating the carefully chosen words. "Thank you, Mayor Johnson. I'll hold you to that." She inclined her head, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly in what might have been the beginnings of a smile. Without another word, she turned and walked out, her footsteps as crisp and deliberate as when she had entered. After she left, Caleb glanced over at Sarah, who had been watching the exchange with quiet interest. She gave him a knowing look. "She's supportive in her way," Sarah said, her tone amused but respectful. Caleb chuckled. "I'll take all the support I can get," he said, glancing around the clinic. The first hurdle had been cleared, but he knew many more were waiting. That evening, Caleb and Darnell sat together in their modest new home, the last of the moving boxes piled up around them. The house was small but comfortable, with worn hardwood floors and windows that looked out onto a quiet street. It wasn't the first time they'd started over, but this time felt different, and both father and son could feel the weight of it. Darnell slouched in his chair, still thinking about the people they'd met and the stares they'd received. He poked at his dinner, a half-smile playing on his lips as he looked at his father. "So, this is it, huh?" Darnell said, pushing his fork around his plate. "New town, new life, all over again." Caleb looked at him thoughtfully, nodding. "Yes, son, but this time, it's more than just a job. This town needs someone willing to stay and fight for what's right. I think this could be that place." Darnell didn't seem convinced. "You think they'll even give you a chance? Feels like half the people here didn't want to see us at all." Caleb smiled, a quiet resilience in his eyes. "Change takes time, but the people who need us, who need this clinic, they'll come around. We just have to be here when they do." Darnell looked down, his expression softened by his father's calm confidence. Caleb reached across the table, giving his son's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "It's not going to be easy," he admitted, "but I believe in what we're doing here, and I believe in you." Darnell nodded slowly, some of the tension in his shoulders easing. "I get it, Dad. Just don't expect me to love this place right away." Caleb chuckled. "I wouldn't dream of it. Just promise me you'll keep an open mind." Darnell nodded, offering his father a small, reluctant smile. All right, I'll try." As they cleared the table, both father and son were quiet, their thoughts on the days to come and the challenges that awaited them. The road ahead was uncertain, but Caleb felt a sense of calm determination settle within him. This was the place he had chosen, and no matter how many stares or whispers met him, he was ready to stay and prove his worth, one patient at a time. The quiet of their first evening in the new home was broken by a knock at the door. Caleb looked up, surprised. It was late, and they hadn't expected any visitors. He glanced at Darnell, who was already half asleep on the couch, and then walked over to open the door. An elderly woman stood on the porch, her frame small but her presence undeniably strong. She was wrapped in a faded shawl, her eyes sharp and alert as they met Caleb's. This was Miss Lucille Porter, one of the oldest and most respected members of the town's Black community. Caleb greeted her with a warm smile, surprised but pleased by the visit. "Miss Porter, please come in," he said, gesturing her inside. She shook her head, waving a hand dismissively. "Oh, no, I don't need to come in, Dr. Monroe," she said, her voice steady and full of strength despite her age. "I just wanted to see the man who finally had the nerve to set up a practice here." She looked at him with a mixture of amusement and admiration. Caleb chuckled, nodding respectfully. "I don't know if it's nerve or foolishness, but here I am," he replied, meeting her gaze. She gave him a nod, her expression softening. "It's been a long time since this town had someone willing to stay and do the work." "A long time," she said, her eyes reflecting years of history and hardship. "But don't think for a second they'll make it easy for you." Caleb felt the weight of her words, but he nodded, undeterred. "I've faced challenges before, Miss Porter. I'm here to help anyone who needs it, no matter what it takes." Miss Porter studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Finally, she smiled, a slow, approving expression that seemed to carry a world of meaning. "Good," she said simply. "Then I'll be seeing you around, Doctor." With a final nod, she turned and walked back down the porch steps, disappearing into the night. Caleb stood in the doorway, watching her go. He felt a sense of pride, mixed with the quiet resolve that had kept him going all these years. It was a small gesture, but her visit was a sign that he wasn't alone, that there were people in this town who understood what he was trying to do and were willing to stand with him, even if only in spirit. As he closed the door, he glanced back at Darnell, now fast asleep on the couch. The challenges would come, and there would be many, but Caleb was ready. He had come here for a reason, and with allies like Miss Porter, he felt more certain than ever that he had made the right choice. The next morning, the clinic doors opened for business. Caleb sat behind his modest desk, reviewing paperwork as Sarah prepared supplies in the back room. Though the clinic had officially opened, no patients had arrived yet. The empty waiting room echoed with an almost painful silence, the ticking clock on the wall marking each passing second. Sarah stepped out from the back, wiping her hands nervously on her scrubs. She glanced at Caleb, her expression a mixture of apology and unease. "They'll come," she said, though her voice didn't sound confident. "It's just, well, it might take a bit." Caleb smiled at her, his tone reassuring. "We've got time, Sarah. I'm not going anywhere." As the morning wore on, a few curious townsfolk peeked through the windows but didn't come inside. Caleb's patience remained steady, though a part of him hoped for even one patient, one person willing to walk through the door. Finally, just as noon approached, the bell above the door jingled, and a woman in her late 20s walked in, her hand gripping that of a young boy with wide, anxious eyes. She looked around, her face tense but resolute. "Are you Dr. Monroe?" she asked, her voice soft. Caleb stood, extending a warm hand. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you today?" The woman hesitated, glancing at Sarah, who offered her a reassuring smile. "My son, he's been coughing a lot," she murmured, looking down at the little boy. Caleb knelt down to the boy's level, his expression gentle. "Hey there, buddy. What's your name?" The boy glanced up at his mother, who gave a nod. "Eli," he whispered, clutching her hand tightly. "Well, Eli," Caleb said with a warm smile, "let's take a look and see if we can get you feeling better." As Caleb led them to the examination room, Sarah watched with quiet relief. It was just one patient, but it was a start. That evening, Caleb and Darnell decided to attend a town meeting held at the community center. Caleb thought it would be an opportunity to introduce himself to the townsfolk and make his presence known beyond the clinic walls. Darnell was less enthusiastic but came along, if only to understand the people and place they now called home. The meeting was already underway when they arrived, the room filled with folding chairs and an assortment of town residents. Caleb and Darnell took seats near the back, listening as Mayor Johnson stood at the front, discussing various town matters. Eventually, the topic shifted, and Harold Finch, a burly middle-aged man who owned the local hardware store, stood up, his face red with apparent frustration. "Now, I don't mean no offense," Harold began, his voice carrying through the room, "but I think some of us here have concerns about new faces coming into town." His eyes flicked briefly toward Caleb and Darnell, though he avoided meeting Caleb's gaze directly. "Especially when those folks don't know how we do things here. Ain't that right, Mayor?" A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others casting uncomfortable glances in Caleb's direction. Mayor Johnson, caught off guard, glanced at Caleb, her face a mask of political neutrality. Before the mayor could respond, Caleb stood up. His calm, steady voice cut through the murmurs as he addressed the crowd. "I understand change can be unsettling," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room, "but I came here to provide a service this town needs. I'm here to help anyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from." The room fell silent, some eyes narrowing, others softening. Harold looked like he wanted to say more, but he hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond to Caleb's poised but firm response. Miss Lucille Porter, who had been sitting quietly in the back, raised her voice. "This town could use a bit of change, if you ask me," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "And I, for one, am grateful Dr. Monroe's here. Lord knows I've been praying for someone to come take care of us." A few heads nodded in agreement, particularly among the older members of the crowd. Darnell watched his father with a newfound admiration, a hint of pride on his face. Mayor Johnson, sensing the tension, cleared her throat and redirected the meeting back to other town matters, though the atmosphere remained charged. Caleb and Darnell left shortly afterward, knowing they had made an impression but unsure how it would play out. A few days later, Caleb woke to the sound of something shattering outside. He jolted out of bed, pulling on his coat as he hurried to the front door. Darnell followed, sleepy but alert. When they stepped outside, they found the clinic's front window broken, shards of glass littering the sidewalk. Spray painted across the door were the words, "We don't need you here." Darnell's eyes widened, a mix of fear and anger flaring in his expression. "Dad, what is this?" Caleb took a deep breath, his hands curling into fists for a brief moment before he unclenched them, forcing himself to stay calm. He placed a hand on Darnell's shoulder, looking into his son's worried eyes. "It's just a setback," he said, his voice calm. "People are afraid of what they don't understand, but that doesn't mean we give up." As dawn broke, Caleb set to work cleaning up the mess. He swept up the broken glass, his movements steady and determined. Sarah arrived shortly after, gasping when she saw the vandalism, but Caleb gave her a reassuring nod. "We'll just keep going, Sarah," he said. "We're not here for the people who don't want us. We're here for the people who need us." Later that day, as Caleb continued to clean, Harold's daughter, Emily Finch, appeared on the clinic steps. She was a teenage girl around Darnell's age, with an open face and a nervous but determined expression. She glanced at the broken window, then looked down at the ground, embarrassed. "Dr. Monroe," she began, her voice quiet, I don't know who did this, but I just wanted to say I don't agree with it." Caleb looked at her, surprised by her courage in coming forward, especially given her father's attitude. He smiled gently. "Thank you, Emily. That means a lot." Emily hesitated, then spoke up again. "And, I was wondering if maybe Darnell would like to come to the school dance this weekend. I mean, if he wants to." Darnell, who had been sweeping up the last of the glass, looked up in surprise, his face breaking into a shy smile. Sure, yeah. I'd like that," he stammered, clearly caught off guard. Emily smiled, relief evident on her face. "Great. Well, I'll see you then," she said, giving them both a small wave before heading off. As she walked away, Darnell looked at his father, a mixture of surprise and happiness in his expression. "Maybe this place isn't so bad," he murmured, his gaze following Emily's retreating figure. Caleb chuckled softly. "Small steps, son. Small steps." A week later, the clinic had slowly begun attracting more patients, many of them older residents who had heard about Caleb from his porter. They came hesitantly at first, but soon, word spread of his gentle manner and expertise. One afternoon, Caleb was in the middle of treating a patient when Harold Finch stormed in, his face red with anger. He clutched his arm, which was bleeding from a nasty cut. Caleb looked up, taken aback, but quickly returned to his calm, professional demeanor. "Mr. Finch, please sit down," he said, gesturing to the exam chair. Harold hesitated, his jaw clenched, but his need for medical care outweighed his pride. He sat down, muttering under his breath as Caleb cleaned and dressed the wound. "Don't think this changes anything, doctor," Harold grumbled, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "I still think this town doesn't need you here." Caleb merely nodded, continuing to work in silence. Finally, when he had finished bandaging the wound, he met Harold's gaze, his expression firm but calm. "I'm here to help you, Mr. Finch, just like I'm here to help anyone who walks through those doors," Caleb said softly, "whether you agree with my presence or not." Harold looked away, grumbling something unintelligible, but as he left, there was a subtle shift in his posture, a reluctance Caleb recognized as the first sign of grudging respect. The night of the school dance arrived, and Darnell stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Caleb watched from the doorway, a gentle smile on his face. "You look good, son," Caleb said, crossing his arms as he leaned against the doorframe. "Ready for your big night?" Darnell chuckled nervously. "I guess. It's just different, you know, being the new kid. And with everything that's happened," Caleb stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Just be yourself, Darnell. They'll see who you are." Darnell nodded, exhaling deeply. Moments later, a car horn honked outside. Caleb watched from the porch as Darnell climbed into the car with Emily Finch and a group of her friends, who waved back at him. He couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Darnell was finding his way, slowly but surely. While Darnell was at the dance, Caleb received an unexpected phone call at the clinic. Sarah had left for the day, and the evening was quiet. When the phone rang, Caleb picked it up, surprised to hear the mayor's voice on the other end. "Dr. Monroe," Mayor Johnson said, her voice tense. I hate to call you like this, but we need your help. There's been an accident at the construction site on Main Street. The workers, they need someone right away." Caleb's pulse quickened, and he didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." He gathered his medical supplies, threw on his coat, and rushed out the door. When he arrived at the scene, he was met with a chaotic scene. Several workers were injured, some worse than others. The local ambulance hadn't arrived yet, and the crowd around the site seemed unsure of what to do. Caleb immediately took charge, directing people to assist him as he tended to the injured. The townsfolk who had been wary of him, even hostile, now watched in awe as he worked with swift precision, stitching cuts and stabilizing injuries. When the ambulance finally arrived, Caleb had already stabilized the most critical patients. The paramedics took over, but several townspeople lingered, watching as Caleb packed up his kit. Harold Finch stood among them, his expression unreadable. As Caleb made his way back to his truck, Harold approached him, shifting uncomfortably. "Doc," he began, scratching the back of his neck. I didn't know you could that you'd be so." Caleb raised an eyebrow, a gentle but firm expression on his face. "I came here to help, Mr. Finch. I hope tonight shows you that's all I'm trying to do." Harold looked down, nodding slightly. For the first time, his usual defiance was gone, replaced by something Caleb hadn't seen before. Respect. "Thank you, document really." Caleb nodded, not needing any more words. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for, a quiet but powerful step toward acceptance. Meanwhile, at the school dance, Darnell was finally relaxing and enjoying himself with Emily and her friends. The gym was decorated with colorful lights and streamers, the music loud and lively. Darnell had spent the evening laughing, dancing, and letting his guard down for the first time since arriving in town. As the evening wore on, he and Emily stepped outside for some fresh air, escaping the noise of the dance. They found a quiet spot by the edge of the gym, looking up at the stars. "Thanks for coming tonight, Darnell," Emily said, glancing at him shyly. "I know it hasn't been easy, with everything that's happened." Darnell nodded, looking down at the ground. "It's been hard. People look at us like we don't belong." Emily reached over, touching his arm gently. "You do belong. People just take time here. But I'm glad you're here. Really." They shared a quiet moment, both of them understanding the weight of being different, of pushing against expectations. Darnell felt a warmth growing in his chest, the sense that maybe, just maybe, he could find a place here. The next morning, Caleb and Darnell sat at their kitchen table, sharing breakfast and recounting their nights. Caleb listened intently as Darnell described the dance, the friends he'd made, and the laughter he hadn't expected to find. "It sounds like you had a great time," Caleb said with a warm smile. "I'm glad, son." Darnell shrugged, but there was a smile on his face. "Yeah, I think I'm starting to see what you meant about giving people time." Caleb's face grew serious as he recounted the accident at the construction site and the progress he'd made with some of the townsfolk, particularly Harold Finch. He saw Darnell's face light up with pride, and they both shared a moment of understanding. "We're breaking through," Caleb said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "One step at a time." Later that week, Ms. Lucille Porter invited Caleb and Darnell to attend the town's small black church, a gathering place for the few black residents who lived in the area. Caleb hadn't realized how much he needed this sense of community until he walked into the modest church and saw the familiar faces of those who had come before him. The service was warm, filled with joyful music, clapping, and heartfelt sermons that spoke to Caleb's soul. As he sat beside Darnell, He felt a renewed strength, a reminder of the history and resilience he carried with him. Miss Porter caught his eye from across the aisle, giving him a knowing nod. She had been right to encourage him to come. This was a place where they could feel seen, embraced, and valued. After the service, Miss Porter introduced Caleb to the other congregants, who welcomed him and Darnell with open arms. He realized that while he was working to build bridges with the town at large, this smaller community would be his anchor, a reminder of the strength he drew from his heritage. The next day, Caleb and Sarah were busy at the clinic when Miss Porter arrived with a group of townsfolk from the church, each of them carrying baskets filled with homemade meals, flowers, and small tokens of appreciation. They filled the clinic's waiting room, their presence a visible show of support that surprised Caleb and Sarah alike. Miss Porter, standing at the front, looked at Caleb with pride. "We just wanted to show our appreciation, Dr. Monroe. You've been a blessing to us, and we're here to stand with you." Caleb was speechless, overcome by the kindness and gratitude in their faces. He exchanged a glance with Sarah, who was also touched, her eyes shining with emotion. "Thank you," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than I can say." As he looked around the room at the faces of those who had come to support him, he felt a surge of hope. He was not alone in this town. He had allies, a community that believed in him, even if they were few. As Caleb and Darnell began to settle further into the town's rhythm, the quiet acceptance they had started to feel was met with a sudden backlash. In the following weeks, whispers and rumors circulated about Dr. Monroe's methods, his past, and even his motives for coming to the town. It seemed as if someone was actively working to stir up distrust and fear. One evening, while Caleb and Sarah were closing the clinic, she hesitated before speaking, her expression troubled. "Dr. Monroe, I thought you should know. Harold Finch's brother, Joe, has been talking. He's telling folks that you're here to take over and change things in ways that people aren't ready for." Caleb sighed, his face a mix of disappointment and calm resignation. "It was bound to happen, Sarah. Change makes people uncomfortable." Sarah nodded, frustration clear in her voice. "But it's not fair. People are finally starting to see what good you're doing here." Caleb put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, Sarah. We'll just keep doing our work. Actions speak louder than words." The rumors culminated in a confrontation one morning when Caleb arrived at the clinic to find Joe Finch and a small group of townsfolk gathered outside. Their expressions hardened. Joe, a wiry man with a sharp gaze, stepped forward as Caleb approached. "You think you can just waltz in here and start telling us how to live?" Joe sneered, his voice carrying a venom Caleb hadn't encountered before. "We don't need you here, Doctor. We've gotten along just fine without you." Caleb met his gaze calmly, his tone steady. "I'm here to help anyone who needs it, Joe. That's all. I don't want to change anything that isn't already broken." Joe scoffed, gesturing to the small crowd behind him. "Broken? Is that what you think we are? Just a bunch of broken people waiting for you to fix us?" Caleb took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "No, that's not what I mean. But everyone needs help at some point, Joe. That's all I'm here for. I'm not here to judge anyone." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some glancing away, clearly unsure about the confrontation. Caleb noticed that even among Joe's supporters, a few faces looked conflicted. Harold stood at the back, watching the exchange with a thoughtful expression. Caleb continued, his voice calm but firm. "I don't expect everyone to trust me right away. But I'm not leaving, Joe. So you can either make this harder for everyone, or we can find a way to work together." Joe glared at him for a moment, fists clenched, but Caleb's unwavering composure seemed to deflate his anger. Muttering under his breath, he turned and walked away, the small crowd dispersing along with him. Caleb stood tall, watching them go, a renewed determination in his heart. Later that day, Harold Finch surprised Caleb by stopping by the clinic, his demeanor quieter than usual. He looked around, then leaned in slightly, speaking in a low voice. "Doc, I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Joe, he's my brother, but he's wrong about you. I can see that now. Caleb nodded, recognizing the significance of Harold's words. Thank you, Harold. That means a lot. Harold shifted uncomfortably, as if he wasn't used to such vulnerability. Look, if you need anything, help with repairs or, someone to back you up in these town meetings, you let me know. Caleb smiled, nodding gratefully. I appreciate that, Harold. Truly. Harold nodded once, then turned and left without another word. But Caleb felt a new connection forming, a bridge of understanding where there had once been only suspicion. As the weeks went on, the tension in town grew, and Caleb began to feel the strain. Despite the support he was gaining from some, the resistance from others was constant. Darnell noticed the toll it was taking on his father, and one evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, he finally spoke up. Dad, do you ever think maybe we should just leave? Darnell asked quietly, his face filled with concern. I mean, there are so many other places where you'd be appreciated. Caleb looked at his son, his expression pained but resolute. I've thought about it, he admitted, but every time I do, I remember the people who've started to trust us. People like Miss Porter, Sarah, even Harold. They need us, Darnell. I can't just walk away from that. Darnell nodded, though he didn't look fully convinced. I just don't like seeing you go through all this. You deserve better. Caleb reached across the table, resting his hand on his son's. Sometimes, doing what's right isn't easy, Darnell, but it's worth it. And I think in time, things will change here. They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in thought. Caleb's resolve was firm, but he knew that keeping Darnell's faith in their choice would be just as important as maintaining his own. One morning, a wave of illness swept through the town, affecting several families. Children were out of school, businesses were half-staffed, and worry spread as more people came down with a severe flu-like illness. The local hospital was overwhelmed, and Caleb's clinic became a lifeline for those who couldn't get immediate care. For days, Caleb and Sarah worked tirelessly, administering medicine, providing care, and offering comfort to worried families. Miss Porter came by often, helping however she could, bringing food and supplies to keep their spirits up. One afternoon, as Caleb was treating a young boy who had come in with his mother, she grasped his hand, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, doctor, she whispered. I don't know what we'd do without you. Caleb smiled, exhaustion clear in his eyes, but a sense of fulfillment evident as well. I'm just glad I can help, he replied softly. As words spread about his tireless efforts, even some of the more skeptical townsfolk began to see him in a new light. The illness, though a hardship, had provided a way for Caleb to show his unwavering commitment to the community. By the end of the week, the worst of the illness had passed, and Caleb finally allowed himself a moment to rest. He was cleaning up the clinic one evening when Joe Finch walked in, his face somber. Caleb looked up, surprised but cautious, unsure of what to expect. Joe shuffled his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment. Doc, I just wanted to say I was wrong about you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't think you cared about this town, but you've proven me wrong. Caleb studied him for a moment, then offered a small, forgiving smile. Thank you, Joe. It takes courage to say that. Joe looked down, then nodded, visibly relieved. I know I've made things harder for you, but if there's anything I can do to help, you just let me know. Caleb extended his hand, and Joe shook it firmly, both men recognizing the significance of the gesture. For Caleb, this was a moment of reconciliation, a sign that even the hardest barriers could be broken down with time and patience. That evening, as Caleb and Darnell sat on their porch watching the sun set, Darnell broke the silence. Dad, I think I'm starting to understand why you stayed, he said, his voice thoughtful. It's like people here needed to see what real kindness looked like. You're teaching them, just by being you. Caleb looked at his son, pride and warmth in his gaze. Sometimes people need a reminder of what's possible, Darnell. And sometimes, we're the ones who have to be that reminder. Darnell nodded, his expression contemplative. It's hard, but I think we're where we need to be. They sat together, the quiet of the evening surrounding them, both father and son feeling the weight of the journey they had taken. Caleb knew that the road ahead would still have its troubles, but in that moment, he felt a sense of peace. They had earned their place in this town, not through force or argument, but through resilience, kindness, and unshakable resolve. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Caleb felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that his journey wasn't over, but he also knew that he had finally, truly, become a part of the town. Spring arrived, breathing new life into the town. Trees bloomed, and people gathered in the square for the annual Spring Festival, a tradition that brought together families, neighbors, and local businesses. It was the perfect setting for Caleb and Darnell to see just how far they'd come. As Caleb and Darnell wandered through the bustling square, they were greeted with nods, smiles, and even friendly waves. It was a far cry from the guarded, suspicious glances that had greeted them months ago. Miss Porter spotted them and waved them over, her face alight with pride. "Look at you two," she said, hugging them both warmly. "Feels like you've always been here." Caleb chuckled, feeling genuinely at home for the first time. "We couldn't have done it without you, Miss Porter." They were soon joined by Mayor Rose Johnson, who offered Caleb a warm handshake. "We're lucky to have you here, Doctor. The town is better because of it." Caleb glanced around, seeing faces from all corners of the community. Families he had helped through illness, neighbors who had once been wary but now looked at him with appreciation, and even Harold Finch, who gave him a friendly nod from across the square. The festival felt like a celebration not only of spring but of the progress Caleb and Darnell had helped inspire. Just as the afternoon's events were winding down, an unexpected emergency struck. A young child ran through the crowd, panic on his face as he called out for help. "Mom's hurt. She's fallen," he cried, tears streaming down his cheeks. The crowd parted, and Caleb quickly moved toward the boy, who led him to his mother, lying on the ground with a visibly injured leg and a bleeding forehead. Without hesitation, Caleb took control of the situation, giving clear instructions to those around him as he examined her injuries. Sarah, who had been nearby, rushed over to assist. Together, they worked quickly, stabilizing the woman's leg and calming the panicked child. Mayor Johnson coordinated with the ambulance service, ensuring that emergency responders were on their way. As Caleb worked, he noticed the crowd watching with admiration, many whispering words of gratitude. By the time the ambulance arrived, the woman was stabilized, and her family was reassured. Caleb stood up, brushing off his hands, and found himself surrounded by appreciative townsfolk. A voice from the crowd broke the silence. "Thank you, Dr. Monroe. You're a blessing to this town." The words hung in the air, a collective acknowledgement of Caleb's role in the community. He felt a wave of emotion, gratitude mixing with a profound sense of purpose. The acceptance he had worked so hard for was finally taking root. After the emergency, Caleb was met with warm, personal expressions of gratitude. A young couple approached him, the husband offering a handshake while his wife handed him a small basket of homemade goods. "We wanted to thank you, Dr. Monroe. You've done so much for us all," the woman said, her voice sincere. Caleb accepted the gift with a grateful smile. "Thank you. It means a lot to me and my son." Darnell, who had been watching from a short distance, stepped forward, a newfound sense of pride on his face. The townsfolk smiled at him, recognizing that his journey had been as challenging as his father's. Emily, Harold Finch's daughter, stood beside him, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. Miss Porter, who had watched the entire exchange with pride, approached Caleb. "You've built something real here, Doctor. Something lasting." Caleb nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "It's more than I ever imagined." The following week, Joe Finch arrived at the clinic. Caleb's initial surprise was soon replaced by understanding. Joe had come not out of pride, but out of necessity. Joe walked in, his face flushed, clearly uncomfortable but resolute. "Doc, I need your help," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been having chest pains." Caleb nodded, his voice calm and professional. Let's get you checked out, Joe. As Caleb examined him, Joe was quiet, staring at the walls, avoiding eye contact. But when Caleb reassured him with a quiet, steady voice, Joe finally looked up, a mixture of regret and vulnerability in his eyes. "You know, Doc, I didn't make it easy for you," Joe muttered. "I guess I was afraid." Caleb paused, his expression one of understanding. "I know, Joe. Change is hard, but we're here now, working together, and that's what matters." Joe nodded, visibly relieved. "Thank you for not giving up on me." As Joe left, Caleb watched him with a sense of peace. In that small gesture of gratitude, Caleb knew they had finally reached a point of reconciliation. Weeks passed, and the day of Darnell's high school graduation arrived. Caleb sat in the audience, pride evident on his face as he watched his son walk across the stage. Darnell's journey had been as much a testament to resilience as his own, and Caleb felt a deep pride in how his son had faced the challenges of being new, different, and sometimes even unwelcome. As Darnell received his diploma, the crowd erupted into applause. Among the clapping faces were familiar ones: Emily, Miss Porter, Sarah, and even Mayor Johnson. Harold Finch nodded proudly, and Joe, standing beside him, joined in, offering his own applause. After the ceremony, Caleb embraced Darnell tightly. "You did it, son. I couldn't be prouder." Darnell grinned, looking over at the town residents who had gathered to congratulate him. "We did it, Dad. This place, it feels like home." Caleb smiled, his heart full. He knew Darnell was right. They had woven themselves into the town's fabric, becoming part of something larger, something meaningful. In the weeks following graduation, Caleb decided to host an open house at the clinic, inviting the entire town to celebrate their shared journey. It was a chance to honor the past, acknowledge the struggles they had overcome, and celebrate the newfound unity within the community. The clinic was filled with laughter, food, and stories shared among friends and neighbors. Miss Porter gave a speech, honoring Caleb's dedication to the town, reminding everyone of the history they had overcome together. "Dr. Monroe has shown us what resilience and kindness look like," she said, her voice ringing clear and strong. "He's taught us that healing isn't just about mending bodies, it's about mending hearts." Caleb felt a swell of emotion as the crowd applauded. He looked around, seeing the faces of those who had once doubted him, who now stood beside him as friends and allies. As the night drew on, Caleb and Darnell shared a quiet moment on the porch, looking out over the crowd. "Do you ever regret it, Dad?" Darnell asked, his tone serious. "Coming here, staying through all the hard parts?" Caleb shook his head, a gentle smile on his face. "Not for a second. This place, these people, they're family now." Darnell nodded, satisfaction and pride in his eyes. They both knew the journey had changed them, taught them the value of persistence, and given them a place to belong. As the months passed, Caleb's clinic became an integral part of the town. Harold Finch began volunteering at community events, working alongside Caleb to strengthen the bonds they had built. Joe, now healthier, often stopped by the clinic, always with a friendly word and a nod of respect. Darnell, inspired by his father's journey, decided to pursue medicine, hoping to carry on the legacy Caleb had started. On the morning he left for college, Caleb hugged him tightly, the words unspoken but understood between them. "I'll make you proud, Dad," Darnell promised, his voice filled with conviction. "You already have, son," Caleb replied, his heart full of pride and hope for the future. A year later, life in the town has settled into a comfortable rhythm. The clinic has grown, with Caleb taking on a new assistant and expanding services to accommodate the increased trust and reliance the town places in him. But with progress also comes the bittersweet experience of saying goodbye to old friends. One morning, Caleb receives a call from his Porter's family. She has passed away peacefully in her sleep, leaving behind a legacy of wisdom, resilience, and kindness. Her passing is felt deeply by the community, especially by Caleb and Darnell, who had come to see her as family. The town gathers for her funeral, filling the small, white-walled church to capacity. Caleb is invited to give a eulogy, and as he stands at the pulpit, He reflects on the impact Miss Porter had on his journey. She was the one who encouraged me to stay, he says, his voice strong but full of emotion. She believed in me when it was hard to believe in myself. Miss Porter reminded us all of our history and our strength. She'll live on in each of us, in every act of kindness and every barrier we break. The congregation nods, some wiping tears from their eyes. Caleb finishes his speech, feeling the weight of his friend's absence, but also the enduring strength she passed down to them all. A few weeks after Miss Porter's passing, Mayor Rose Johnson stops by the clinic. She sits across from Caleb, her expression serious but warm. "Dr. Monroe, I have a proposition for you," she begins, her eyes scanning the familiar space. "This town owes you a lot. You've done more for us than anyone else could, and I believe it's time we make that official." Caleb raises an eyebrow, surprised. "What do you mean, Mayor?" She smiles. "I'd like you to join the town council. We need someone who understands the needs of all our residents, someone who can help us shape the future. And I can't think of anyone more qualified than you." Caleb is taken aback, both honored and uncertain. He considers the offer, understanding the commitment it would require, but also the impact it could have. "Thank you, Mayor. I'm honored," he replies thoughtfully. "But let me think on it. I want to make sure I can still give my best to my patients." Mayor Johnson nods, understanding. "Take your time. We'll be here," and the offer stands. After she leaves, Caleb reflects on how far he's come, from being the town's outsider to being someone trusted to shape its future. It's a testament to the journey he and Darnell have shared, and he knows Miss Porter would be proud. Not long after, Darnell returns home from college for a short visit, bringing stories of his studies and his newfound ambitions. They sit together on the clinic's porch, watching the town's evening bustle as the sun sets. "Dad, I'm thinking about doing a residency here," Darnell says, his voice filled with excitement. "I want to work with you, maybe even take over the clinic one day." Caleb's heart swells with pride, his face breaking into a broad smile. "I'd love nothing more, son. You're ready for this. And this town could use a Monroe legacy in medicine." They share a quiet laugh, feeling the weight of what they'd built together. Darnell's desire to continue Caleb's work feels like the closing of a circle, a dream Caleb had scarcely allowed himself to imagine when they first arrived. With Darnell's enthusiasm and support, Caleb decides to use his potential position on the town council to advocate for a community health initiative. He presents a plan at the next town meeting, detailing expanded access to preventive care, wellness programs, and outreach to underserved families. The proposal is met with enthusiasm, and even Harold Finch stands up to voice his support. "Dr. Monroe's right. This town's future depends on us taking care of each other. And he's shown us how to do just that." The town council unanimously votes to pass the initiative, dedicating funds to expand the clinic services and establish programs that will continue long after Caleb and Darnell are gone. Caleb feels a sense of triumph and gratitude as he realizes the lasting impact he and Darnell have created. Months later, the town holds a dedication ceremony at the clinic to commemorate the expansion and celebrate Caleb's contributions. The new wing of the clinic is named after Miss Porter, honoring her legacy and her encouragement that kept Caleb rooted in the town during the hardest times. Caleb stands before the crowd, flanked by Darnell, Sarah, Mayor Johnson, and Harold Finch. As he speaks, he looks out at the familiar faces of those who had once been strangers, been skeptics, and now friends. "This town gave me and my son a home when we needed it most," he says, his voice filled with gratitude. "Today, we honor Miss Porter, who reminded us of our strength, and the entire community, who showed us that resilience is a shared journey." The crowd applauds, their appreciation visible in every face. Caleb feels a deep sense of fulfillment as he realizes the legacy he and Darnell have built together. A legacy of healing, resilience, and connection. As time passes, Caleb begins transitioning the clinic's leadership to Darnell, who has returned full-time after completing his medical training. The clinic now hums with new energy, as Darnell brings fresh ideas and innovations while honoring the foundational values his father instilled. One evening, Caleb stops by the clinic, now more a mentor than a primary doctor. Darnell is busy consulting with patients, his manner calm and attentive, a mirror of his father's approach. Caleb watches with pride, seeing himself in his son. He feels the weight of his own journey lifting, replaced by the joy of seeing Darnell carry it forward. On a quiet Sunday morning, Caleb takes a walk through the town square, greeting familiar faces, many of whom now consider him family. He reflects on the journey from newcomer to trusted community member, from outsider to the heart of the town's healthcare. Stopping in front of the clinic, Caleb pauses, savoring the moment. He remembers Miss Porter's first visit, Harold Finch's initial hostility, and Darnell's struggles to fit in. All those moments, all the challenges, have woven together into a beautiful tapestry of resilience and acceptance. Darnell steps out of the clinic to join him, smiling as they look out over the town. "Ready for a break, Dad?" he asks, his voice light. Caleb chuckles, nodding. "I think it's time. This place is in good hands." Father and son share a quiet moment, feeling the weight of all they have accomplished. Caleb knows that the town's future is bright, with Darnell continuing the work he started. The town had tested them, shaped them, and ultimately embraced them. And now Caleb feels a sense of peace, knowing he has left behind something lasting and good. As they walk back home, side by side, Caleb reflects on his journey with gratitude. The town is not just where he and Darnell found a place to belong. It's where they built a legacy of healing, understanding, and hope. If Dr. Caleb Monroe's journey moved you, subscribe now to stay connected to more inspiring stories of resilience, healing, and community. Subscribe today.